Let's now talk about the cardiovascular system, its major functions and general organization. So, it should really come as no surprise to you that the major functions of the cardiovascular system have to do with transport. The cardiovascular system transports oxygen and nutrients to tissues, right? So you get oxygen coming out of the lungs, going down to the muscle or the brain or whatever organ. The cardiovascular system is responsible for that. It also transports and removes wastes and other tissues. A clear example is CO2 is transferred. It's produced in the muscle and other places, and the cardiovascular system takes it from the muscle to the lungs where it can be exhaled. One more that you might not have really considered before is that the cardiovascular system is also responsible for the transport of heat. And if you're cold, it will keep heat from going to the skin. Let me put it a better way. If you're hot, let's say your muscle is producing a lot of heat, your body wants to get rid of that heat. And so the blood, the cardiovascular system transports that hot blood from your muscle. It transports it to the skin where the heat can then be dissipated by evaporative cooling and other ways. So the cardiovascular system, it transports oxygen and nutrients to the muscle and to the tissues like glucose and other things, hormones. It transports stuff away for waste, and it also transports heat and regulates body temperature. Now, in terms of the general organization of the circulatory system, this is going to be up to you a lot to study. These are things that hopefully you've learned in the past, but go in your textbook or watch stuff on YouTube to get caught up with what the main structures of the cardiovascular system are. Particularly know the atria, the ventricles, what the aorta is, and really know what the cardiac cycle is. Where does the blood first go into the heart? Where does it last leave the heart? Where is it oxygenated? Where is it deoxygenated? These are things that you need to study on your own. I'm not gonna spend time in the video on them. Also, make sure you know some other major structures, like the names of the valves, the different major veins and arteries. Like the biggest artery that leaves the heart is the aorta. Know that. Uh, and then extremely key to our future discussions will be understand what the differences are between arteries, arterioles, and capillaries, and what the difference between capillaries, venules, and veins are. Make sure you understand these differences. You can find these in your textbook or on any YouTube video. So in previous discussions, we've talked a lot about skeletal muscle, right? We talked at the beginning of the semester about how you get action potentials that cause the release of calcium from the skeletal muscle that causes actin and myosin to interact and generate force. Well, in many ways, the heart, cardiac muscle, operates in a very similar way. Cardiac muscle or heart muscle is not the same as skeletal muscle. There are some key differences, but a lot of the stuff that we've already learned applies very well to cardiac muscle. So let's talk about some of the main differences. One key difference is the shape of the skeletal or the cardiac muscle fibers. Skeletal muscle fibers are are long and one strand, whereas if you look at a cardiac muscle fiber, they have some branching going on so that they can interact with multiple different muscle fibers. So they're not just a single strand, but they have some forking and can interact with multiple fibers. One of the benefits of that is that cardiac muscle also has something called gap junctions. And that means that an action potential generated on one cardiac cell can be transmitted to a neighboring cardiac cell. That doesn't happen in skeletal muscle, right? In skeletal muscle, we have the size principle of orderly recruitment, where we first recruit our type 1 fibers. So the nerves that are in contact with those cause them to contract, and the ones next to them, if they're innervated by a different nerve, they remain dormant. That's skeletal muscle. In cardiac muscle, once you generate an action potential on one, it should be traveling all throughout the heart from one heart cell to the next. And the route that it takes, the action potential takes, going from one heart muscle cell to the next, helps determine how the contraction is going to go. Let's see, what are some other key differences here? Uh, so skeletal muscle can be extremely long and requires multiple nuclei. Heart muscle, from what it seems, has about just one nucleus in charge of all the transcription and translation inside of that single cell. Now, in terms of function, the heart muscle, if it was a skeletal muscle and was fiber typed, it would be a super duper type 1 muscle. Your type 1 aerobic skeletal muscles, they have somewhere around 3 to 5% of their volume made up of mitochondria. I've seen different estimates on this, but the heart is sometimes around 25%, 25% of the volume of the heart muscle cell can be taken up by mitochondria. These muscles, cardiac muscles, are extremely aerobic. And think about why that would be. It's been contracting since before you were born. When you go to bed at night, your legs get a break. When you go to bed at night, your arms get a break, but your heart keeps beating and it's been beating since before you were born. So it has to have an incredible amount of endurance to just keep going and going and going for hopefully many, many years. And part of that endurance comes from its aerobic energy production. Another thing that's different between your cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, you can decide when it contracts, right? You have voluntary control. Cardiac muscle, you don't. It it goes on its own. You can't tell your heart to beat faster or slower. You can't tell it to skip a beat. It's autonomic or automatic. It does it on its own. You don't get to determine that. So, as I mentioned, with these gap junctions, that when an action potential is generated in one muscle cell, it's that deep wave of depolarization can be transmitted to neighboring ones through the gap junctions. And in that way, you can get almost like a wave at a stadium, like a football game. It starts in one spot. Usually, your action potentials in the heart start up at the SA node, and it will be transmitted through the muscle cells, first all throughout the atria, so that the contraction starts here at the top and slowly moves over to all the atria. And then once the atria have contracted, the action potentials make its way to the AV node, and then the action potentials will travel down through the ventricles in that fashion. So starting at the top and then contracting towards the bottom of the heart is how this is going to go. And it happens in a very coordinated fashion. And you can have things like fibrillation or a discoordination of these action potentials that results in parts of the heart contracting at the wrong time so the blood isn't ejected effectively. Now, another key difference with these action potentials in the heart is that they can generate on their own. In a in a normal, like in a skeletal muscle cell, you have to get to threshold, right, for an action potential to happen and for a contraction to occur. And in a skeletal muscle cell, that won't happen unless you have some kind of graded potential or an EPSP, some kind of activation, getting positive ions to go into the muscle cell. Well, in a cardiac cell, it will generate action potentials on its own and contract on its own. It doesn't require the nervous system at all. In fact, you could take a heart out of a person for a heart transplant and it will still keep on beating. You put it in a new person that receives a transplant, you don't transplant the nerves or the brain, but it still keeps on beating on its own. Now, most of the times they put in a pacemaker there to help control the beating, but it can beat on its own even without any kind of nervous system. And the reason for that is because the membrane potential does not hold steady. A skeletal muscle membrane potential will just hold steady on its own down here away from threshold. In a cardiac cell, it is progressively leaky, so it continually depolarizes on its own. So even if you have no EPSPs, it will eventually contract. And the rate at which that happens is about 100 action potentials per minute, or 100 heartbeats per minute. You can modulate this with the parasympathetic and sympathetic activity of the heart, which we'll talk about in a minute, uh, but it will happen on its own. These cardiac cells can depolarize all by themselves. Now, in this sense, with the heart, parasympathetic stimulation will result in hyperpolarization, bringing the heart cardiac muscle cells further from threshold, which will slow down your heart rate. Sympathetic stimulation with epinephrine, norepinephrine will depolarize. It's an EPSP and bring you closer to threshold and increase your heart rate. Another key difference with cardiac muscle versus skeletal muscle is how calcium release is triggered from the SR. In skeletal muscle, you might remember that an action potential travels down the T tubules and interacts with ryanodine receptors and dihydropyridine receptors to cause calcium to come out of the SR. We don't have that set up in the heart. It works a little bit differently. You generate an action potential you have like the sympathetic nervous system stimulating receptors on the cardiac muscle cell. And when it binds, when the epinephrine, norepinephrine binds, it'll cause calcium to come in to the heart, a small amount of calcium, not a lot. And it comes in through these L-type calcium channels. And so a little bit of calcium comes in, and as it comes in, it's enough to trigger the SR to release a ton of calcium, a lot of it, okay? So you get maybe 20% of your calcium for the contraction coming from the L-type calcium channels and 80% coming from the SR. But nothing would come out of the SR if it wasn't for those L-type calcium channels. First, you get a little bit of calcium coming in like a graded potential, and that triggers the SR to release its calcium, which then will go bind with troponin and initiate a contraction very similar to what you would see in a skeletal muscle. Let me see, what else should I point out here? So you'll also have calcium uptake and other things going on here. Um, another key part here is that the amount of calcium that's released from the SR can happen in kind of a graded fashion, where if you only have a little bit of calcium coming in from the L-type calcium channels, it will only stimulate a little bit, relatively little bit of calcium release from the SR, which means less cross-bridging. If you have a lot of calcium coming in, then you're going to stimulate a lot of calcium from the SR, calcium release, and get a lot more cross-bridging. So one of the ways that the sympathetic nervous system increases the force of the heart, the contraction force, is by increasing how much calcium comes through these L-type calcium channels, which in turn increases calcium release from the SR, which results in more cross-bridging and more forceful contractions, which allows you to eject more blood. Anyone going on to any kind of career in medicine, a lot of drugs target this mechanism here. A lot of drugs will target the interaction with epinephrine and the calcium channel, or the calcium channel directly, to control blood pressure. All right, let's stop there for this video.